because I can't see you.
Você vai colocar uma imagem ali, tipo assim, para mim pegar lá na sala ou não? Ou já vai deixar direto? Acho que era bom para começar. Eu vou falar algumas coisas no começo.
Ah, tá. Eu vou colocar na...
Isso, isso. I will say some words in Portuguese to start, and then I pass the word for you.
Lovely, thank you.
Começar? Posso começar?
Pode.
Boa tarde, pessoal. Bom, meu nome é Roosevelt Rocha, eu sou professor aqui da Universidade Federal do Paraná, da área de letras clássicas. E hoje a gente vai começar o nosso evento aqui. Não sei se dá para colocar na tela o cartaz do evento. Que é a segunda reunião do grupo de estudos da música greco-romana e suas ressonâncias. Aqui a gente tem um cartaz, um banner. E essa é a segunda reunião. A primeira reunião aconteceu em Pelotas em 2019, em junho de 2019, numa outra época, num outro tempo, quando as coisas eram diferentes. Agora a gente está fazendo um evento híbrido, né? A gente tem algumas pessoas aqui, numa contagem rápida, acho que 7, 8. E a gente está transmitindo pela internet também. Isso tudo certo para gravar, né? Está sendo gravado. Então, né, posteriormente vai ficar disponível na página do Departamento de Polonês, Alemão e Clássicas, né? E aí, quem tiver interessado pode ir lá e assistir ao vídeo. Temos aqui a presença do professor Fábio Vergara Cerqueira e do professor Marcos Mota, e de mais alguma assistência aqui. Não vou falar o nome de todo mundo, senão vou ficar a tarde inteira. Não é? Bom, mas a gente vai ter... acho que podemos colocar a programação? Tem a programação? A gente vai ter a palestra da professora Dr Lynch, que está na Inglaterra, vai falar para nós aqui. A gente vai assistir aqui na UFPR, mas vai ser transmitido pela internet também, né? O título da palestra é Singing with the Muses, New Paths into Ancient Mousikē, né? Uma apresentação rápida da professora Tosca. Ela é formada em piano, é pianista e também é formada em filosofia pela Universidade de St. Andrews, se eu não me engano, na Inglaterra, e nos últimos anos tem estado ligada à Universidade de Oxford como é que se diz isso? Fellow, tipo, não sei, bom, ela é pesquisadora associada, né, na Universidade de Oxford, e às vezes dá aulas também. Tem muitos artigos publicados sobre música grega, de modo geral, e 2 livros em especial eu gostaria de destacar. Um livro em que ela, junto com Mário Vegetti e outro autor, cujo nome eu esqueci agora, mas é um livro sobre a República do Platão. E o mais recente que ela organizou é um livro, um companion, né? Uma introdução importantíssima para quem quer se atualizar, né? E ter uma introdução sobre a música da Antiguidade Clássica, né? Que foi publicado pela Blackwell. E provavelmente deve sair, né, nos próximos meses, um livro que, na verdade, é uma adaptação da tese de doutorado dela, que é um livro sobre a música e a teoria do ethos em Platão, né? Bom, agora podemos passar a imagem para a Tosca. So, Tosca, hope this presentation was enough. If you want to say something more, something else, please.
No, I think that's more than enough.
I think that you have understood many things that I have said.
Yeah, most
so,
of it.
Tosca, thank you for being here today with us.
It's a pleasure.
So I pass the word for you. Thank you.
Absolutely. So can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Lovely. Now you can see my presentation as well.
Yes, everything is right.
Excellent. Thank you. So thank you very much, Roosevelt, for the kind invitation and the very, very generous presentation and introduction. It's lovely to be here, although it's a bit weird not to be able to see you, but hopefully you can see me and everything is working all right. And also excuse me for the cold, but mercifully my test this morning was negative, so I should be fine. But anyway, excuse me for the kind of weird tone of voice. So, as you all know, especially after this introduction, my main research field is ancient Greek music, and with a special interest in the lively debate that took place in classical Athens about music and its meaning and its technical underpinnings. As you all know very well, differently from what most people normally expect, the Greek concept of Mousikē didn't denote only music in the modern sense of the word, but embraced many other products, as it were, of the arts of the Muses, including dance, poetry, drama, as well as solo and choral singing and instrumental music. But the Greek cultural discourse on music didn't focus only on these performative aspects. It also involved a complex repertoire of cultural values that were associated with different musical idioms, preferences, and styles, and contexts as well. So for this reason, I believe that this is necessary, indeed vital, to embrace a complex, multifaceted, and polyphonic, as it were, approach in order to try and recapture some defining aspects of the ancient experience of Mousikē. In other words, I believe we need to look at ancient music through a sort of kaleidoscope in the etymological sense of the word. So a complex approach that enables us to observe constantly changing, but also deeply related pattern of beautiful shapes and musical forms, theoretical as well as practical, imagined, as well as experienced in performance. So over the last 10 years or so, I've developed a new approach to the study of ancient music that combines technical and theoretical evidence concerning ancient harmonics, rhythmics, and notation with key cultural insights offered by literary and philosophical sources. To start with, I've offered some technical informed examinations of Plato's persuasive but not naive use of musical theory and practice. So in contrast with common but sadly ill-founded myths, I have shown how Plato was acutely aware of the technical implications of his musical choices and actually exploited them to reinforce central points of his philosophical projects, including the definition of temperance and justice, and the harmonic organization of the universe, of the cosmos as a whole. Likewise, as I will show in a book that I'm currently writing, Plato's characterization of the emotional effects of the classical modes, harmoniae, is far from being a figment of his philosophical imagination and is actually deeply rooted in the musical traditions and practices that shaped the core of classical Greek culture. Reconstructing the sounds of ancient Greek music, therefore, from a practical as well as a theoretical point of view, I believe is vital to recapture and bring back to life some key aspect of ancient culture, literature, and philosophy. For this reason, my research has also explored the much debated harmonic innovations introduced by the so-called new musicians and the impact they had on the development of classical harmonic theory. In particular, I offered a reconstruction of the complex modulation system that the new musicians developed in late classical times and its relationship to the two main families of Greek instruments, double pipes, alloy, and professional lyres called kitharai. combining insights offered by comic and lyric poetry with technical evidence ranging from Aristophanes to Ptolemy and Aristides Quintilianus, I showed how professional singers such as Timotheus could produce up to 7 different modes on one and the same string instrument without interrupting their performance to retune it. A true revolution that overturned the traditional model of the 7-string lyre and mimicked legendary harmonic flexibility of the aulos, allowing kithrodes to perform long, highly mimetic songs that featured intricate melodic and rhythmical modulations. This was obviously shocking to conservative intellectuals and audiences, but won a great success with the wider public. Then, in 2 recent articles, I have shown in detail how the reconstruction I originally outlined in 2018 is fully supported by the evidence of the Greek musical documents, thanks to a new database that I have recently developed and collects the musical notes attested in the standard edition of the Greek musical fragments, Permanent West documents of ancient Greek music, for a total of over 3,500 notes. This new tool makes it possible to analyze this standard record of ancient musical scores on the basis of various criteria, including Hellenistic versus imperial documents, instrumental versus vocal notes, and their harmonic organization into different groups of related tonoi, keys that were employed to write down ancient music. For the sake of time, I cannot discuss this evidence in detail, so I will simply summarize some key points that cast a new light onto the development of the classical harmonic system as a whole. So the first of these articles shows, for instance, how 100% of the notes attested in the classical documents and Hellenistic documents fall within the range of the Dorian perfect system, i.e. the 2-octave range that goes from F2 to F4. And this is in keeping with the evidence that is offered by technical as well as literary and philosophical sources. So we have lots of passing references in both comedy and philosophy to the foundational role of the Dorian octave and the Dorian mode. And so far it proved difficult to link this to the evidence we have from the musical documents. So this is one important insight that comes from the new evidence I've gathered. This article also shows how the intermediate notes, mesai, of the 3 defining modes of classical music, Dorian, Phrygian, and Lydian, which were also known as the three tropoi, or the 3 basic modes, as it were, their intermediate notes are in fact the most frequent notes employed in the relative families of keys that we find in the Greek musical documents. Once again, something that it was indicated by theoretical sources, but was to date, up to now, had been proved to be hard to link to the evidence we have from the musical documents. So, as you see here, this is one of the figures of one of the articles, and you find here the summary of the distribution of the notes, of the Dorian notes, attested in classical and Hellenistic musical documents. As you can see here, the Dorian messer is actually the most frequent note attested in these documents. And in keeping with this, 99% of Dorian notes fall within its central octave, which goes from C3 to C4. Likewise, Phrygian messer, G3, is the most frequent note attested in classical and Hellenistic documents written in the 3 Phrygian vocal keys. And 89% of these notes fall within that it's the central octave of the Phrygian key, which is a tone higher than the Dorian, and so it goes from D3 to D4. Similarly, the intermediate note of the simple Lydian mode, which was called Lydis D, is E3, and is the most frequent note attested in the same group of documents written in Lydian vocal notation. A point is important to underscore. And 96% of these notes fall in the simple Lydian octave, which was semitone lower than the Dorian one, so B2 to B3. As you can see at the bottom, the Lydian harmonia recorded by Aristides Quintilianus is pretty much identical to this central octave, which kind of outlines embraces most of the notes attesting these in Lydian vocal documents. And finally, tense Lydian messe A3 is the most frequent note in classical and Hellenistic documents written in Lydian instrumental notation. And 90% of these notes fall in the tense Lydian octave E3 to E4. An important point here that must be noted is that the terms that were employed to identify the harmoniae were slightly different from the terms employed to indicate the keys. So at the bottom, you see a tense Lydian mode recorded by Aristides Quintilianus, and that was called tense Lydian. But for a very complicated process, it ended up being identified with the Lydian tonos. So tense Lydian mode ended up being equated with the Lydian tonos. This shift is once again something I've identified recently, and explains lots of seemingly inconsistent testimonies, but it was largely actually a matter of different terms being employed by different kinds of people. So tense Lydian was a term that was employed traditionally. So that's what we find in Plato, Aristotle, and so on. And whereas Lydian tonos was actually a new kind of label that was developed by the new musicians in order to create a kind of consistent system based on just 3 keys and not 7 modes. It's a very complicated issue, but if you want to read about it, you can find more evidence in the first article, Lynch 22a. Anyway, the important point here is that the relative messe of the 3 Dorian, Phrygian, and Lydian modes, both tense Lydian and simple Lydian, effectively represented about 1 in 5 notes employed in pieces set in the relative triad of keys. So basic Dorian, for instance, with hypodorian and hyperdorian, which you can see in the case of Lydian here in the graph reported here, diagram. So this, interestingly, this is perfectly consistent with the evidence offered by a classical source on ancient Greek music and its kind of theoretical underpinnings. So we read here in the Aristotelian problems, all effective melodies use messe a lot, and all good composers come upon it often. And when they get away from messe, they come back to it quickly, whereas they do not behave in this way with any other note. It turns out this is indeed the case, as we have seen earlier on. And this is also interesting because it says, the author says, messe is, as it were, a conjunction among notes, and especially between beautiful ones. And this idea of messe being a conjunction is very important both for the theoretical concept of conjunct and disjunct systems and for the philosophical use of these concepts at Plato, as well, the way in which Plato exploits this idea in the construction of the soul of the whole in the Timaeus. But anyway, let's go back to the technical evidence about music. So building upon this rather complex and varied background, I recently started to look at archaeological finds as well, which are an interesting and strikingly convergent source of independent evidence that confirms the technical, theoretical, and cultural models I outlined earlier on. For example, as some of you may know, I've recently produced a 3D model of the Louvre Aulos, as well as a few others, but I will take this one because it's very important and very famous. And so I've produced this 3D model on the basis of photos and very detailed measurements published in 2014. So this is a very good starting point for further analysis and discussions. So as you can see here, these wooden pipes of unknown dating were probably produced in Greco-Roman Egypt, and they are remarkably well preserved, which is, again, another point that is important for what we are going to discuss later on. The designs reflects a harmonic model that was firmly established in the 4th century BC. It is consistent with the structure of the greater perfect system, which is the underlying model that informs the development of the harmonic system, as we were saying earlier on. So, for instance, classical poets, including Euripides and others, describes this kind of instrument as Libyan lotos, and we find this expression in Helen, for instance, or Phidinaina at Aulis. And this particular label refers to the kind of African wood that was employed to produce its instruments, as opposed to ivory or bone, which were very common types of materials that we find, for instance, the Ephesus aulos and many others. So this is remarkably well preserved and at the same time very rare, because obviously it is very hard to find wooden alloy that have survived, and especially so well preserved instruments. Even though the design of this instrument is consistent with what we know about classical harmonics, this particular pair of pipes is likely to be late Hellenistic or imperial, which is an important point to evaluate the scale it might have produced. At the moment, as far as I know, there is no radiocarbon dating, so we can't have further evidence to sort of evaluate these points. So in the interest of time, I will not get into the details of how exactly the process of 3D modeling works, but I will show a few snapshots of different stages of the project, which, as you can see here, as well, I don't know whether you can see it here or not, but I have used a new app that is available on the iPad, and a pen, which is I found it to be an extremely intuitive way of going of interacting with a model, which made a big difference to me in how how the process felt. And these images hopefully give you a sense of how the process works and different kinds of things you can do with this app. So you can import, for instance, images, so you have all the data you need right there. And you can also change, obviously, perspectives, change the color of different parts of the instrument and see it and move it around, and change and edit different parts of the instrument, which is very helpful to adjust it at different stages. And the model can also be seen in section view. So you can see that you can reveal otherwise hidden parts and get a better sense of how the whole thing sort of was organized. So as I said earlier, these pipes are exceptionally well preserved, but an essential part of the instrument is nevertheless missing, namely its reeds. Ancient Greek alloy employed double reeds. A point is very important, and are kind of make them similar to modern oboes, and not single reeds as clarinets, for instance. Sadly, no ancient reeds survive intact to this day, but we have many sources that provide us with pretty good and solid evidence that allows us to reconstruct their essential features. So these sources come from different kind of, as it were, disciplines in our own terms, but they are very important. It's important to take them all together in order to get a bit closer to recapturing the features of this missing part of the instrument. So one of them, of the types of sources we have, is this broken specimen of a reed from Egypt, which is a double reed, as you can see, and seems to be fitted into a flute, but I haven't seen it myself. But it nevertheless is an important source that confirms other, let's say, representations that we have received, including this one, which is a sketch of a double reed that was still fitted into the lower pipe of the Berliner Aulos when the museum acquired it in 1894. Sadly, it's been lost, as far as I know, in the meantime, but it is significant to see just how similar they are, and both in design and in kind of relative ratios, as it were, proportions, as the word I was looking for. And as you can see, it fits very well into the Berlin Aulos, and these pipes are actually very similar to Louvre. So it's an important piece that confirms the wider evidence we were looking at earlier. A third source of evidence is iconography, given that musical instruments are often depicted in some detail. But it's important to make some distinctions here. A few vases and statues, in fact, represent reeds as well, as you can see here. But not all of them are directly relevant for this particular pair of pipes, the Louvre Aulos, because we know that there were very different types of alloy in classical times. Aristophanes, for instance, mentions 5 different classes of alloy, ranging from small, high-pitched pipes for girls, parthenioi, and boys, paidikoi, to alloy suitable for men, including kytharidic pipes, as well as complete and hypercomplete ones. Elsewhere, we hear in other sources, we hear also about different types of pipes that were developed for special types of performances, so which may or may not have been identical to some of these. For instance, a hypercomplete one might have been identical to some of the other that we hear in Athenaeus, for instance, but at present I don't think we can tell with certainty. Anyway, the important bit here is that we must keep in mind that there were different types of alloy, and therefore we need to look at the contexts that are represented in iconography in order to determine whether this one is particularly relevant or not for the type of instrument we are looking at. So these alloy were considerably different, very different in register and size, and Aristophanes tells us that they covered a very, very large range So the highest note of the girl aulos and the lowest note of the hypercomplete were more than 3 octaves apart. So that was a significant range, which obviously required very different types of instruments and different reeds. So that's an important point to keep in mind. One side note, but something that I hope you will remember and help me kind of spread the word a bit about, is that the fact that these alloy were equipped with double reeds means that they were closed pipes and not flutes. Sadly, this mistaken translation is still very frequent in literature as well as museum catalogues, etc. But it is fundamentally misleading, and because, as we know, the Greeks had obviously flutes as well. These instruments were called plagialoi, but they had a completely different design. These are pictures from Crescent's article in our companion, and as you can see, this is a remarkably well preserved specimen of plagialoi, and he actually reconstructed it beautifully. And as you can see, it's very different in structure. The mouthpiece is completely different. So we can tell when one instrument, most of the time, when one instrument is one or the other. And this was an open pipe, no reeds around, so it behaved in a completely different way. And these differences are actually reflected in the iconography. As you can see, the mouthpiece here is very visible and is actually very similar to what we have in the plagialos, the couleur instrument. And it's very easy to see that they are very different instruments. So it would be lovely if both translations and catalogues could highlight the difference we know, and also flutes were used in very different settings, and again, both, it is very clear in the iconography as well as literary compositions. So this would be really a major, a very helpful improvement that should be pushed for, I think, in literature and catalogues, because otherwise it's very misleading and very complicated also to find specimens and identify them correctly. So the fact that alloy were closed pipes is also very important for us, because for the process of trying to determine the scale they produced. So in order to try and do this, I have developed a simple mathematical model that calculates basic pitch of the notes produced by different finger holes on the basis of variable reed lengths. My calculator then automatically identifies these pitches with modern notes, which are adjusted by microtonal variations expressed in cents if necessary. Then this identification can be adjusted on the basis of different timbre pitches, which is important in order to evaluate not just the internal structure of the scale itself, but the relationship it had with the wider harmonic system and the tunings employed at different stages. Sorry. As I will show in another publication I'm currently, that is currently in preparation, the scale produced by Louvre aulos corresponds to well-established tunings described in theoretical sources. But a word of caution, I think, is in order, not to give a misleading impression of this kind of tool, or indeed many others that have been developed, in many ways much more sophisticated ones that have been developed by other scholars in recent years. Any modern oboe player will tell us that double reeds are extremely temperamental, and the pitch they produce can change significantly over time, sometimes up to a tone. So it's quite a lot. So Plato and Aristophanes point out, for instance, that the same was true for ancient alloy too. So they both, in very different ways, but they both point out how unreliable, as it were, these instruments were in order to have a kind of fixed point of reference to identify different scales. Obviously, both Plato and Aristophanes, albeit from for very different kind of perspectives, they were looking for some ways of determining structures, scales, and harmonic structures in a way that was sufficiently precise, and therefore, for these reasons, the variability and flexibility, to see it in a positive light, of aulos and their scale, of alloy and their scales, was obviously not exactly desirable from their point of view. So they point out how aulos players would bend or adjust the tuning of different notes in a way that made them basically made the patterns of different finger holes a basic starting point that aulos players adapted to produce different tuning shades. So they could bend the pitch of the individual notes by a variety of technical means, such as half covering individual holes, and as well as variations in embouchure. So the pitches identified by the calculator, mine as well as those developed by other people, and the reed length, the lengths that are identified at different stages must be taken as a simple starting point that must be complemented by other types of evidence. So a starting point for something, for a kind of more nuanced historical and cultural assessment. And also by these kind of evidence must be confirmed also by practical experiments that can try and recapture the feel of ancient performances. The fifth and final kind of evidence that we can use to try and reconstruct ancient reeds is an extended passage from Theophrastus's History of Plants. And this passage describes the particular features and growth patterns of the type of reed cane that the Greeks used to produce their double reeds. And also, he also describes how different the process of producing these reeds were, depending on its style, the playing style that different musicians developed over time. Which is interesting to see, once again, how, just as in the case of the theoretical evidence we mentioned at the start, also the technical kind of development went hand in hand with the sort of, as it were, the practical development of instruments went hand in hand with the styles of what being developed over time, and the need for greater flexibility and variations, chromatic especially variations. So Theophrastus describes some key steps in the process of reed manufacture and production, and this evidence has been invaluable in the process of trying to replicate these vital elements of ancient instruments. And Callum Armstrong is particularly advanced, I think, in this area, and you can see some pictures of his own experiments at different stages. As I said earlier, these practical experiments are necessary to confirm other types of assessments and hypotheses. And this process can be a source of useful insights in itself, provided that we are always aware of the cultural biases we have and do all we can to avoid projecting unwarranted assumptions onto ancient Greek musical models and practices. This is why I strongly believe that literary, philosophical, and technical sources must always be the bedrock of practical experiments. On the other hand, ethnomusicological parallels with living musical cultures that are closer to what we know about the ancient Greek world can also offer us extremely helpful parallels and correctives at times. So here is the final model I produced on the basis of these sources, seen from the top here, as well as from different perspectives. As I will show in an article, the scale produced by this model corresponds to well-known ancient modes and also matches iconography very closely. You can see here two examples from Peleus Painter, so classical times. These vases are found at the British Museum. And you can see here a detail of a female aulos player in a context of a symposium. And the model I prepared is pretty, confirms, it matches quite closely both the dimensions and the placement of the hands of the player. Likewise, you can see here another stamnos, where a mythical character is adjusting one of the reeds, and once again the proportions are pretty consistent with the model I produced. You can find an interactive version of this 3D model on Ancient Mousikē, the new website I've launched in the spring, which you may have already seen perhaps, and offers a variety of different types of evidence and tries to make them more accessible, because sometimes we have a problem of that it is caused by how many different types of expertise, indeed, and technical languages one needs to be more or less familiar with in order to try and relate to these models. But now I think the possibilities given to us by these new technologies make it possible to overcome, to some extent, at least at the start, the obstacles posed by the interdisciplinary nature of these studies. So this is an example of the kind of outreach work that I think is possible by means of these new technologies. And so this particular model offers, on the same page, you can activate the 3D model. I'll try and make it work later on and see if that's visible on your screen. But if not, you can go and try it on the website by yourselves. And at the same time, you can click on the strip underneath, so you can actually hear some music played on a replica of the Liber Aulos by Callum Armstrong again. So it's a very interesting combination, I think, to be able to explore the instrument at the same time, hear the kind of sound it could have played. Obviously, the music Callum was playing is improvised, So it isn't necessarily a faithful model that you should kind of take as a evidence for what ancient Greek music sounded like. We have other types of performances, one of which I will talk about in a moment, which are instead based on ancient scores. But hearing him explore different possibilities may widen perhaps our own imagination and help us understand what kind of different sounds and different registers the same instrument could play. I think Callum is one of the most advanced performers we have at the moment. Although at the same time, it's hard to some extent to understand the full possibilities of instruments such as the chromatic alloy in Pompeii, because we don't have a living tradition of professionals. Because obviously the liver alloy were relatively simple instruments that were employed by people from different kind of backgrounds and not necessarily only professionals, whereas in time we have a much more complex development of instruments as well as techniques. And so obviously it's hard for us to imagine even how flexible they could be and how complicated the kind of music they played in fact was. And I think it's a helpful parallel for us to think about contemporary classical music, for instance. If we had lost a living tradition and then suddenly were faced with, I don't know, very, very advanced music, it might even seem impossible at first sight. Obviously, because a lot of the technical as well as practical skills are developed by oral tradition, by direct example, and so it's very hard for us to, at the moment at least, to recapture in full how these instruments worked. At the same time, I think in comparison with, say, 20 years ago, we have made significant progress. So there is, I think, lots of scope for improvement in the coming years. On the website, you can also find a video performance of Athenaeus' Paean, which is a performance that has taken place at the Ashmolean Museum in 2017. And you probably know that this is an extremely complex piece, very chromatic, this is, as you can see here, a new transcription I have provided of the second section of this piece, and as you can see, it is rather complex. The transcription I've provided gives both the modern equivalents, obviously, and the Greek notes, and the Greek text, so you can follow in good detail what is going on. And obviously, notes that are repeated were not repeated in the Greek score, at least not in the classical and Hellenistic musical documents, whereas the style, the convention changes later on after the big gap we have from the say the end of this 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. Afterwards, when we kind of re-emerge from that gap, we find very different types of styles, as well as different conventions that were followed in order to write music down. This complex piece is discussed in let's say the harmonic structure of this piece is discussed in great detail in a recent article of mine. And as you can see here, I think you can read it. It also illustrates the kinds of chromatic bendings, kampai, that were so typical of the new music. So you can see from M to O to Mi to Omicron, you can see there. There is a sign saying bend, because this was the kind of chromatic bending of one of the two central notes of the Dorian octave system. And that was one of the so-called chromatic variations. So that were also known as sprained melodies. So the idea that the basic structure was damaged to some extent. And this is obviously reminiscent of the terms employed by Lady Music in Phaedrus, where she decries all the attacks that she suffered, and in very sort of powerful terms. And so this goes to show how intensely these variations were felt to be by conservative audiences. So you can find a performance on the website, and if you wish, I can try and play it now. But if you do choose to listen to it, please be kind, and keep in mind that we had a grand total of 3 rehearsals before this concert. So for this and many other reasons that I'm happy to discuss later on, it is only a starting point, really, but it still gives you a sense of the general feeling that this piece might have had, including both its kind of more relaxed sections and relatively more challenging harmonic and very intricate melodies, harmonic system and intricate melodies. This is interesting because it's a good contrast between the relatively simple rhythm, it stays more or less the same throughout, and the very complex and indeed challenging harmonic structure of especially the second section you can see here. This contrast between relatively simple rhythms and intricate melodies is actually highlighted in Plutarch as something that was a kind of poikilia, so a kind of variety that was developed by probably late classical authors, as opposed to the relatively simple melodic structure and modal structure of early music, which was, however, complemented by a rather intricate rhythmical variety. It's an interesting contrast, which we still have to, I think, investigate in greater detail. I have done a bit of work on rhythmics, on ancient rhythmics, and one of the important, I think, elements to keep in mind is that, as far as we can tell, the ancient perception of rhythm wasn't based largely on contrasts in, say, volume, but in contrasts in relative pitch. So something that kind of mirrors the importance of pitch accents, which were largely a matter of variations in pitch and not variations, at least the kind of prevalent element, was a variation in pitch and not in volume. I think something similar, as far as we can tell, was true for the rhythmical perception as well. So our syntheses have been very complex and contested terms. I have shown in 2016 that the evidence, if we kind of try not to project our own assumptions onto the Greek sources and Latin as well, the picture we get is pretty consistent throughout. The only real variations comes in when we look at rhythmical, as in musical sources, as opposed to metrical sources, which were a later development largely, and were developed in order to help largely students who needed to acquire a kind of perception, especially the practice of scansion was developed for this end, and needed to acquire a way to mark these differences that they were not hearing anymore in a kind of natural way. There's some consistent evidence that goes from, I don't know, for instance, well, both metrical treatises and Augustine and lots of different types of evidence point out, and Aristides himself really point out that the kind of mindset was radically different between metrical theorists and rhythmical theorists, with the exception of a mysterious group which kind of weaved the two together, but we don't really know very much about it. The same kind of difference in the development of the language that was employed by different groups of people is actually similar, the development to what we have seen earlier about the clash between the different keys, and then the clash between the names of keys and the names of modes, so traditional modes versus the new keys. So it's also the reason why I mentioned this is that it's very important to always keep in mind, you know, who is the audience, who is the kind of or potential source, if we know it. Where are we getting this information from? And sometimes, you know, keeping in mind that the two things can the kind of words and terms developed by different sorts of people to talk about music may be remarkably different. So I think this brings me to the end of my presentation. If you'd like to receive updates, please sign up to join our mailing list, and you can also follow us on Facebook or get in touch with me in other ways. I think I can't see you, but I'm happy to try and share a bit of the 3D model from the website if that works, but we don't know. Do you want me to try?
Yes, thank you, Tosca, for this wonderful lecture. It was very informative, and I'm sure that we have many questions here. So,
lovely.
Can you see the chat on the YouTube?
I didn't know that we were on YouTube, so I don't think I can.
If you stop the sharing.
Yes. So I like that. Yes.
Yes.
And I can. Well, I don't know. I still don't see anything.
Can you see the chat? No.
Nope.
Okay. I will ask the audience here if someone have some.
Okay, you can also read out the questions if.
Okay. I will pass the microphone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Tosca. My name is Marcos Mouta. I'm here.
Lovely to meet you, kind of.
And I'd like to have a question about your next book on Plato. So can you talk more about it? Because I'm so interested in Plato, and I'm studying performance. So because sometimes we talk about music. Music is, before music we have sounds, and the ancient Greek culture, in order to have sounds, you need performance. You need someone to produce sound, is someone to the reception of the sound. So, and this model of production and reception of the sounds, this model is present in Plato. Even Plato talks against performance. He uses performance to explain music and other subjects. Can you talk more about your book on Plato?
Yeah, well, I don't know how long it will take to finish it, to be honest, because it ended up being more than one book. So anyway, the first one will be about ethos and especially the way in which Republic 3, what the kind of modes Plato mentioned and rhythms Plato mentions in Republic 3 and the kinds of instruments. Then I probably leave other issues to the second book, because otherwise it will be too long. But what I'm trying to do in this book is showing how, well, you know, sometimes scholars have been rather dismissive about, you know, Plato's knowledge and his expertise in music, which I always found, say, strange, to be very sort of polite. But what I try to do in the book is showing how what we know about the technical aspects of music actually confirm in detail the characterization of different modes that Plato gives in Republic 3 and their emotional effects, and also the ways in which, for instance, you may have seen my 2016 article where I've showed how the modes that are rejected from the ideal city were particularly closely associated with the aulos, whereas the modes that are kept, Dorian and Phrygian, were all very suitable in terms of their structure recorded by Aristides for performance on the lyre. So in many ways, what I try to do there is put the pieces together and see how the technical evidence we have and sort of cast light onto the characterization of Plato. In other words, it's not in contrast. What he was saying is not in contrast with his tradition, but is precisely rooted in that tradition. Does it help?
Well, Tosca, we have two questions made by Viviana Sugnol from Buenos Aires. The first one is, what do you think is the main philosophical difference between the Dorian mode and the Phrygian one in Aristotle's Politics and Plato? Do you want me to repeat? No.
No, I understood. Well, it's again a chapter of the book, so you will have to wait for the book to have the full answer. But in many ways, the characterization that we have in Aristotle is not as how can I say, as objective as it tries to present it. So you know, there is a scholarly tradition that tends to regard what Plato writes as, you know, in a rather dismissive light, whereas they tend to take Aristotle's words as more faithful to practice. Turns out that this wasn't always the case, and there's the case of the Phrygian mode depends very much, I believe, on the context and on the particular instruments. So that's we know from Aristodes and other sources that and Aristocles himself, that the characterization of ethos didn't depend on a single let's say on a single parameter, but it depended on the mixes, the mixture of different elements, especially modes, rhythms, and instruments, at the very least. So it's important to evaluate the interplay between all of these elements in order to. So it's not really possible to give a sort of clear-cut and definitive answer in that sense. On the other hand, the inner structure of the scale, for instance, the fact that it was bounded by an octave was in itself important in order to determine its harmoniousness as it was perceived in ancient Greece. So, and the internal balance between different tetrachords. So that's something that I try to explain in the book. You know, how they had a fairly it's a fairly detailed way of accounting for that. Obviously, we don't have anywhere in the sources the term ethos theory, so it's really misleading to try and think in those terms. But there was a kind of constellation of ideas. It wasn't really kind of a clear-cut theory, but there was a constellation of ideas that kind of allowed people to try and make sense of the effects they were feeling.
Thank you, Tosca. We have a second one here, also by Viviana Sognol.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that the aulos was considered an instrument that can't be part of education and was used for cathartical spectacles?
Mm-hmm. Well, part of it is, well, there's many layers to this answer. The first one I was thinking of now was that the effect of that instrument, the kind of immediate sounds that it plays, are extremely moving. It's very powerful as a kind of instrument. So that's one of the reasons why it is important to point out that it was double reeds and not single reeds, because the kind of the quality of the tone is very, very different and much more powerful in that sense. But so one aspect of it is the kind of immediate aesthetic quality of the sounds. On the other hand, there is also a kind of polemical overtone to the characterization of the aulos not being suitable for particular types of educational contexts, because obviously there is a big myth of Marsyas and Athena, and all that idea of being disfigured by the player, by playing the aulos, which obviously in the context of Kalogeithea was problematic. And also the perhaps a contrast between Athens and Thebes, so or anyway Athens and the rest of the world, you know, in some ways. So the idea of marking a difference between the style, what was regarded as beautiful and noble and appropriate for a certain type of boy or girl, especially boys, sadly. But I think that was an important marker of status in many ways. Although we know that Alcibiades, in keeping with his, let's say, colourful background, actually learned how to play the aulos as well. So it's much more. I think in some ways the representation of the ideology we have is not always consistent with what was practically the case, especially in different settings. So we tend to have an inflated sense of what the Athenian idea was, as opposed to the kind of wider Greek world. But it's an important thing to explore, I think.
Thank you, Tosca. Anyone else? Alguém mais quer fazer uma pergunta? Sergio. We have a question by Sergio.
Hello, Tosca. I'm Sergio Antonini from Buenos Aires. Nice to
Hello.
see you. You have said...
I can't see you, but it's nice to meet you.
You have said in your next book you will be talking about a scale in the Louvre Aulos. I have understood well. What kind of scale? I suppose you mean chroma, or what kind of scale of, I suppose, Phrygian scale you think the Louvre Aulos has?
Well, I can't get into the details now, but it's not going to be in the book, this one. It's going to be in an article. So it will hopefully be available later on. It is slightly different from what we might expect in that the dating is relatively late. And so we are talking about a different system as opposed to the classical one, which, as you may have seen the two articles on the classical system, and those are based on the Dorian mode. What we have after the big gap in the documents, musical documents, so basically from the 1st, 2nd century AD onwards, is a very different harmonic system. And as far as I can tell, the Louvre Aulos belongs to that environment. So it's a slightly different type of scale, but as you hopefully it will make sense once you can see the article talking about it and setting out all the differences in detail.
Thank you, Tosca. Me too. I would like to make a question. Unhappily, with the camera here doesn't work now. But in the last days, I was reading a lot of Aristophanes fragments, and there is one in Plutarch's on music that says that Sappho was the inventor of the Mixolydian, and the Mixolydian was similar to the Dorian scale, mode, harmonia. So, do you think that we could take all the information that we have about the Mixolydian and try to compose some kind of melody to try to sing the fragments that we have by Sappho?
Well,
what do you think about this proposal?
You may have seen in the article that I have, I think I have identified precisely the ways in which the Mixolydian was produced by bending some notes of the Dorian. So, and they are actually, as far as I can tell, reflected in the Ashmolean papyri and the Athenaios Ispaean. So you can see some examples in the Greek musical documents. And I think if you take those, and it also kind of makes sense because the ways in which the Mixolydian and the Dorian are aligned, so they basically overlap on the same octave, and the distinction was largely one of bending one chromatic note and having slightly different septimal intervals at different stages. So something that could be produced very easily by means of embouchure, for instance. So it's perfectly consistent with all the other types of evidence we have mentioned earlier. So if one were to take these models that we have and then try, we do have the basic skeleton, as it were, of the rhythm. Determining exactly where our synthesis would be an interesting experiment to see, for instance, whether following the pattern of the accents would have an interesting effect or not, and seeing whether they tell us something about, you know, variations within is a kind of relatively fixed form. So in principle it would be fun, but yeah, with a bit of caution.
Well, Tosca, thank you a lot. Thank you very much. And well, we will follow here our event, and if you want to follow us on the internet, you have the links. And
Yeah.
we say goodbye, but we hope that we can keep on touch on the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Bye.